So one of the things that we've done is figured out how do you create predictable and competitive results within the lifestyle and fund bucket. And just a buzzword in finance is diversification. For us, diversification is not just diversifying what you're invested in, it's diversifying what we would call your time horizons. It's diversifying the actual asset allocation itself, and it's also diversifying the taxes. So starting with time horizon diversification, this is one of the areas that we feel like the industry has gotten the most wrong. What is common when clients come to 49 Financial that have worked with other advisors is they have a portfolio and we ask them why it's invested in the way that it is. They would say, well, I took a risk tolerance questionnaire and they asked me a number of questions, and believe it or not, most clients would say, I'm not overly aggressive. I also want to make sure that I'm making returns. They land somewhere in the middle of that, and they have all of their investments invested in a particular way. So Travis, the best way that I can explain how these three forms of diversification work and how impactful they can be is with a client story that we see all too often in 49 Financial. We had a client that came to us and he was mindful of risk. He wanted to make sure that he wasn't taking too much of it, but also wanted return. He didn't have a clear way to be able to define risk. And so when we looked at what he was doing with another advisor, he was all too conservative in his approach. And so as we came to him and helped understand what would it look like for you to take the appropriate amount of risk, and we defined that based on when he's going to need the money rather than him just giving here's my definition of how much risk I want to take. We were able to map out for him, what if you had 3 years worth of expenses set aside that are not invested in the market. We're getting competitive return, but it is not experiencing the volatility and fluctuation within the market. What if we had then another 3 years of investments that are invested, but at a more conservative clip than we would be if we went with a more actively managed approach with all of the dollars. And he looked at that and said, based on the income that I have coming in, and then I have an additional, for him, 6 years worth of expenses that have been allocated for. He said that accomplishes everything that I would want in terms of managing risk. And so he then felt comfortable investing the rest of the dollars more aggressively within the market and felt completely comfortable with the overall risk that he was taking. But the return was a very, very meaningful difference compared to where he had been. It was really only about 15% of his assets that he needed within those first 6 years of expenses, rather than where he had been with the previous advisor was somewhere around 40% being invested in a really conservative way. So by starting with when we're going to need the money and letting that define the risk rather than just giving an arbitrary definition to how much risk we want to take, you see a really meaningful outcome. But then nobody had ever walked him through, well, what's the best way, even in managing that risk, to be able to do it? There's the debate of, well, how should you invest in today's economy? Should you be more passively invested? Should you be more actively invested? And our answer to that was, you should do both. There's not one that is better than another. We just need to be really strategic within both. Within the passive investments, we're going to be, again, very strategic in the way that we approach that. You can really save fees in the way that you approach it, but you can also build in risk mitigation and guardrails around it through things like structured investments. And so for him, that made sense to be a part of the plan as a baseline, and making sure that year to year, if the market did have a big dip or there was volatility, that he would be well taken care of, and that we would have a portion of assets that wouldn't experience those same dips. And we also overlaid an actively investment strategy on top of that. So in the areas of the economy where we feel like there's overconcentration, or we feel like we want to have exposure because they're actually undervalued, we had a big part of the portfolio that was invested in taking advantage of those things. And the combination of those two is really powerful, because it allows you, from a risk-adjusted return standpoint, to take the right amount of risk while also maximizing the return that you're looking for within that risk. And then the last piece is taxes. We feel like that's one of the most under-discussed aspects of a financial plan, or even if it is being discussed, people don't have the real strategies to be able to actually make a meaningful difference within a client's plan. And so for him, it also became looking at things like what's going to be taxed as ordinary income or capital gains and tax-free, and helping him to build out frameworks of, well, what percentage do we want to have in each of those? And how do we actually take the next steps and build strategies to allow you to build into the tax nature that we want within each of those? All of those, again, go back up to the predictable nature of the lifestyle and fun. If you can get those three forms of diversification right, you can build a very predictable plan that you know is going to last you through your lifetime.